This talk may be somehow different than the previous. Hopefully it will be shorter. And also it may be more like storytelling, because I wanted to start with that, how I started with meditation some 40 years back. That may be quite interesting entry into the topic I want to speak about, this spiritual Himalaya. And it was a time, 40 years back. My knowledge of Buddhism was quite insufficient. I knew some important points I was so inspired by. And I wanted to meditate anapanasati. That was what I knew quite clearly. And that it is possible to come quite far with that meditation. That was also clear to me. But also having some knowledge of the other spiritual directions. Christianity, okay, yeah, some New Testament readings which opened to me in that time. I started to understand what Jesus was talking about. I had some knowledge about Hinduism in the yoga systems. I had a book about that. Karma yoga, hatha yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga. It was not going too deep, but it was a frank presentation of the whole system. It was quite helpful, really. And certainly I had some knowledge about Zen Buddhism, because it was the time when the Korean and Japanese masters were arriving at California, and the beatniks generations, that time basically, Kerouac and Ginsberg, they were inspired by these radical teachings and crazy wisdom. So getting some kind of a knowledge about that. And I remember that my initial inspiration for the Buddhist path was the simile of the elephant footprint. You may know that the elephant footprint being the biggest one among the animals, so that the footprint of all another animals will somehow fit in, certainly will fit in. So my understanding, which was perhaps not exactly what was originally meant by Buddha, my understanding was that all the good things from the another spiritual teachings, I can take it and implement it in my practice, because it must be certainly contained or part of the Buddha's teaching. That was my original understanding. So whatever I was getting from these other teachings, I was certainly taking it very seriously. All belongs into my practice. Which is not exactly true then. The original Buddha's teaching is actually a shortcut. But I did not know at that time. And also remembering that at that time I wrote a lyrics to one of the Pink Floyd songs, which actually expressed quite interestingly my spiritual understanding of that time. Going like this. Again having muddy mood, have you lost your silver flute? Do you want to take off your grey suit? Endless pretending and lies, dishonesty in disguise. Come there where time sinks and never cries. It's the sphere where fires smile. Guns have wings and cannons fly. Tanks distribute silence in the sky. I greet people, embrace life, and all the world with its drive, and the time that counts me 25. I was playing guitar at that time. It's more than 40 years ago. But, it's not the fourth strophe, it's the third one. It's the sphere where conflagrations smile, guns have wings and cannons fly. Thanks distribute silence in the sky. This indicates the quite advanced understanding actually of a very deep kind of non-duality. And also my intuitive understanding of the spiritual task or serious spiritual development, that it will not happen so much by developing boundless love, but rather by radical overcoming fear of death. So today we are going to talk probably about the biggest koan of all times. The different spiritual directions, actually different in the formulation, different in the description, perhaps even different understanding of the aim. But in the last end, are they really actually going towards the same kind of realization, a liberating realization? Or are they different, even in the highest enlightenment? So, this is not an easy topic, and of course, I will make my own reflections, because again, for me personally, this has a quite a specific meaning. As I was talking about it already, I was implementing many different instructions into my beginning spiritual practice, so that also many things happened, and not always these were complementary kind of openings. Some of these were actually slightly contradicting each other. And for the first 20 years I really did not understand my practice, and nobody helped me actually to understand it. So it was a piece of a personal story behind this interest. But in a more general term, of course, this question was also in my generation actually. Many people, some 30-40 years back, they were traveling to Asia and coming with the Western kind of Christian background, encountering such a large variety of spiritual practice in India, in Burma, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, in Nepal, in Tibet, in Japan, in Korea. So that the people at the beginning were sometimes quite confused, right? So, indeed. And I think it was perhaps Daniel Goleman or Joseph Goldstein who came with the kind of a first helpful tool, so to say, to distinguish between two major different kinds of spiritual paths. It was also the beginning of a digital time actually, so the one kind of spiritual path were aiming at the big one, and another different high spiritual directions were aiming at the big zero. And indeed it is a very good symbolic behind that, because this big one is symbolizing all these spiritual directions which are aiming at the big unity, at the oneness. That's the big symbol behind the one. And behind this zero, that would be symbol for all those spiritual directions which are aiming at the emptiness of self, which is mainly represented in Buddhism. So actually I think the great majority of spiritual directions go to the big one. Even the Christianity, this unio mystica, when the mystic were experiencing the unity with God, or in another systems seeing the unity with the primordial self, with the source. The modern spirituality sometimes avoiding the term God, so they sometimes speaks about the source, but meaning again primordial unity. And the Buddhist directions, somehow different, going to the emptiness of self, mainly the emptiness of self, but sometimes even the emptiness of everything. Empty phenomena rolls on. But to tell the truth, I don't use this term emptiness very much, because it can be very easily misleading. In the Western culture, quite often, emptiness has rather a kind of a negative connotation. And of course, within the Buddha's teaching, it means empty of all the undesirable things. And especially when it is relating to nibbana, nirvana. So I prefer some kind of positive approximation, something like sublime peace, very nice, very beautiful definition, or even sublime fulfillment, in the sense that in the scriptures appears this declaration quite often, done was what was to be done. Kind of a existential fulfillment, indeed. But let's be clear that about the same time, that means some 35 years back, there was a opposing idea going around parallelly with this idea of one and zero, that actually all the spiritual systems in the last end are going for the same kind of realization. How can there be two ultimate truths? Argumenting with that. It was actually drawn from the kind of a simile which is appearing in almost all spiritual systems. A simile of the big mountain in the middle of the spiritual system. That there are different starting points at the bottom, but with the progressing on the spiritual path, finally all of them coming to the same kind of freedom and realization. So this was a kind of a beautiful simile, bringing or even bridging this old hostility sometimes appearing among different systems, bringing this sense of brotherhood with all the others, with all those people who are using this life for a great spiritual adventure. And there was a kind of a happiness in that all these conflicts, religious conflicts, take that, all this nonsense, killing people for different type of religion. Certainly, our heart was also welcoming this kind of understanding. And how I could bring these ideas together was that when you look, I was living in Switzerland at that time, when you look at the mountain from a 50 kilometers or 70 kilometers distance, it really looks like a one majestic kind of a cone with one summit. But when you come close, and I was a little bit hiking in the mountains, suddenly you see all the diversity, that the thing which actually looked like a one mountain actually is a mountain range with many different summits and plateaus and abysses and ravines. That the whole spiritual landscape is a multitude of hills and abysses and lakes and enormous complexity opened in front of my inner eye. The foundation for this idea of a large spiritual landscape came from the reflection that there is lots of injustice going around among the religions, quite evidently, but also among the different spiritual systems, kind of animosity, looking down on the others, exalting oneself, denigrating the others, or even declaring them as wrong. So when I started to put the diversity in the formulations a little bit aside and trying to feel the life of the followers of different religions and spiritual systems, completely different picture emerged. When I started to look at the Christianity from the Buddhist perspective, you know, the usual argumentation, you cannot save another, you can save only yourself, you have to work out your own salvation. That's the argument usually put against the Christianity as being wrong. But when I started to look at the life of true Christians, how pure, how honest they live their life, that if we consider a rebirth, indeed the next life will be in heaven, in some kind of heavens, I don't know where. And that in that format, actually Christianity is telling the truth to their followers, in a way. And that with the others is very similar. The only things which is possible to criticize on Christianity from the Buddhist point of view is that it is using the terminology not precisely. Christianity very often speaks about eternity or for eternity. From the Buddhist understanding, very long or even extremely long still doesn't mean eternal. And that after the next life there is another one and another one. And when the good karma is spent, then some lower kind of rebirth is to be expected. So this is the only things which can be criticized on Christianity, that it doesn't present a definitive solution to the problem of existence. So from this time on, it was no more my task to find what is the right one and what is the wrong one, but rather to find the proper place of these different systems within the spiritual landscape. And in this time, some 20 years ago, I wrote an article, the 3 summits on the Mount Analogue. I have it still. Actually, the title, The Mountain with 3 Summits. And clearly the 3 summits, oneness, insight, non-duality. That was the idea crystallizing in my mind after 20 years of my own practice. And the article goes, it seems that contemporary time calls for spiritual clarification. If we accept this invitation, the initial step may be the discovery of joy in our endeavor for proper mutual understanding and appreciation. Following the Buddha's original teaching closely for over 20 years, I wished to look around a little to see how are my spiritual neighbors doing. Moreover, what are they actually doing? So many neighbors in these days. I took a walk through their colorful spiritual gardens, finding there a lot of growth I am well acquainted with, as well as less familiar species. The most unconventional and eccentric flower I met on my excursion was certainly the non-duality. I spent quite some time trying to see the place of non-duality within the Theravada tradition. Not so easy task indeed. The historical Buddha in the suttas did not deal with this matter. It seems that non-duality was not a discussed theme in Magadha, in Buddha's Gautama's time. So that's the beginning of a quite long article. But let me reflect now a little bit more about this 3 summits kind of understanding of the spirituality. And I will start with an article excerpt from a Maichi Cho book. It is ascribed to the great Thai master Ajahn Mahabhava. It goes like this. When you investigate mental phenomena until you go beyond them completely, the remaining elements of consciousness will be drawn into a radiant nucleus of awareness, which merges with the mind's naturally radiant essence. This radiance is so majestic and mesmerizing that even transcendent faculties like spontaneous mindfulness and intuitive wisdom invariably fall under its spell. The mind's brightness and clarity appear to be so extraordinary and awe-inspiring that nothing can possibly compare. The luminous essence is the epitome of perfect goodness and virtue, the ultimate in spiritual happiness. It is your true original self, the core of your being. But this true self is also the fundamental source of all attachment to being and becoming. Ultimately, it is attachment to the allure of this primordial radiance of mind that causes living beings to wander indefinitely through the world of becoming and ceasing, constantly grasping at birth and enduring death. In this sphere, delusion reigns supreme, but once mindfulness and wisdoms are skilled enough to eliminate conscious activity and therefore close this outlet, delusions created by the flow of mental phenomena cease. Severing all of its external outflows leaves delusion no room to maneuver inside the mind, forcing it to gather into the radiant nucleus from which all knowing emanates. That center of knowing appears as a luminous emptiness that truly overwhelms and amazes. But that radiant emptiness should not be mistaken for the pure emptiness of Nibbana. The two are as different as night and day. The radiant mind is the original mind of the cycle of constant becoming, but it is not the essence of mind which is fully pure and free from birth and death. Ajahn Mahabhava was one of the greatest teachers in the forest Thai tradition, direct disciple of Ajahn Mun, very respected lineage. And he was very much making this distinction between the big one and big zero. There is even one more element in the Theravada tradition, actually also supporting this distinction between one and zero. Theravada speaks about Attavada and Anattavada. Vada means teaching. Atta means Atman, the soul, or the self, or primordial self. So with this designation, Attavada, actually, Theravada is addressing all those systems which are teaching soul or self, or the primordial self, in contrast to Anattavada, which would be the original Buddha's teaching, non-self, anatta. In the idea of the three summits on the Mount Analogue, I was rather referring to the different types of liberation these different spiritual paths are arriving at. Also, emphasizing different aspects in the practice. The dominant practice towards the oneness, as I understand it, is the purity of mind. But the dominant practice towards the liberation in the direction of original Buddha's teaching is the insight and detachment, mainly the detachment. And in the area of the non-duality, I will talk about it a little bit later. The non-duality, in my understanding, uses mainly the quality of not making preferences as the main aspect of the practice. Now, of course, now what is coming is purely personal, and don't believe it. It's my own personal understanding of things. Certainly I understand, and not only I, that the Buddhist teaching is making one step further than those teachings which are leading just towards the oneness. It is my conviction, I don't impose it on anybody. Make your own kind of assessment. But quite interesting is this third area of non-duality. I have to start by making it clear that in my understanding there are two completely different types of non-duality. The first kind of non-duality, very high in the Hinduistic teaching, it refers to the non-duality of Atman and Brahman. That's the final realization. In the Buddhist type of non-duality, I understand it is completely differently. It is the merging of opposites. By not having preference, not making any preference, the opposites are merging together. The good and the bad, the correct and the wrong, the wholesome and the unwholesome, all these polarities, the worldly and the supreme, the subject and the object, merging together, creating this dominant perception of suchness, that everything becomes such. So merging of opposites, that's one way to see it, or to see the common source of these dualities. That would be another way of understanding what the non-duality actually does. The mindfulness seems to be so rapid, so instant, that it is catching the initial state of the manifestation before it splits into the one or the other side of the duality. So therefore there is this overwhelming notion of suchness. Everything is such. Certainly it is quite an intensive process indeed, and the experiences of non-duality can be so overwhelming because it is turning upside down everything known before, everything experienced before. So how the non-duality may go in the intensive practice? Certainly there will be a kind of a shift in the meditation. And this may be the time that the mindfulness stops to pick up the interesting and pleasant experiences and to jump over that what is ordinary and uninteresting, that it discovers the same importance to any kind of experience. Very initial stage of non-duality. But then it may happen that the inner world of the inner truth suddenly starts to merge together with that what we are presenting outwardly. Usually these are two completely different roles, what we feel and think for ourselves and how we treat that what is around us. You know, we are usually big players. So this may suddenly start to merge together, that the authenticity of the life starts to increase. There may be time in the meditation that it opens towards the first great meditative experiences indeed, when the mind reaches a stage of purity and the mind is very translucent, very transparent, beautiful, and there is transforming changes in the perception of one's own life. One is tasting the first great results of the practice, and one is touching the area of a true, real inner thankfulness towards the teaching, towards the Buddha. And this is usually the stage when the scale of values starts to turn the other way around. What was considered to be special and desirable before starts to be the last thing, completely unimportant, and that what is ordinary suddenly is discovered as the true valuable thing. I remember one of the first Dhamma talks I was giving when I started to teach had the title "The Diamonds in the Dust of the Road." And it was dealing exactly with this stage of practice. And from this new perspective, many things start to change. For example, reviewing the mistakes in one's own life. So painful, so regretting, so biting us, suddenly are seen in a completely new light. That actually, that was this kind of a pitiful past, which probably was one of the major motivating factors which brought us to this type of intensive practice. And we are seeing now suddenly the things from a completely new side. That what was considered to be bad and wrong, suddenly, what is actually helping and what is actually hindering. Not so easy. Don't be too quick in evaluating these things. So these are the platform where the beginning non-duality starts to operate. And this new perspective can change really the orientation which we got probably mostly from our education. What is right, what is wrong, what is clean, what is dirty, what is intelligent, what is stupid. And these things start to kind of lose the original orientation. And also, especially with the what is right and what is wrong, that was our compass through the life. And suddenly, this arrow of the compass starts to turn any direction. And then more of these polarities, the skillful and unskillful, the beautiful and the ugly, these all things are starting to coming together. And this is the real beginning of the non-duality already. The first non-duality happens in the conceptual mind, because dealing with these things we have learned through the life and also through our conditioned experience. But a new kind of non-dual ethics starts to emerge, which is sometimes quite difficult to swallow, which is very different from that what the world and even the religions are considering as leading elements. But this is the stage in the practice when the subject and object starts to merge. That what was always kept as a kind of knowing quality, the knower, and that what was recognized, the known, the knower and the known, starts to merge into one actuality happening, unsplitted. And this is usually a very crazy time in the practice when the love and the hatred becomes the same, becomes such. And the ordinary and divine, such, and the wholesome and unwholesome. The general orientation starts to turn any direction. Just suchness, just the things as they are in their initial stage. And later on, that what is desirable and that what is repulsive becomes just such. And the emptiness and the fullness, and that what is real and that what is unreal. Very advanced stage of non-duality indeed. Everything starts to be so overwhelming, so streaming. The sameness of beginning and end, of life and death, of pleasant and unpleasant, of suffering and happiness. This is really a very remarkable stage in the non-duality, because the karma stops functioning. The karma is normally related to wanting the pleasant, not wanting the unpleasant. And now everything this is just becoming such, becoming the same. And even the result of karma, when it manifests as pleasure or pain, even that is actually irrelevant anymore. I remember one stage when suddenly came a kind of realization that I am okay. You know, this was a thought never coming to my mind before. There was always this fault finding, what can be better, what should be different, never fully satisfied with that, how the things are. And suddenly now this kind of a landing experience, I am okay. And few minutes later, I've been always okay. Little bit later came the most surprising kind of realization. The world is okay as it is. And the meditation ended with the most surprising, breathtaking realization. There was never anything wrong with the world. And because these are inner openings, I would not call it insight, but kind of realizations. These are not conceptual, so there is no doubt about it. This is the new evidence as it really is. And also in the old article, The Mountain with Three Summits, I was describing the process of non-duality as follows. The non-duality cures the fundamental split of the mind. The inner and outer world become one. The opposites lose their original meaning, merge into one another, and melt into sameness. Things are no more nice or ugly, important or insignificant, pleasant or unpleasant, true or false, worldly or spiritual, good or bad. They cannot be right or cruel or kind. It is impossible to do anything wrong anymore. Everything bases itself in its intrinsic isness, which is the only real aspect of all phenomena. Here lie the most controversial paradoxes peacefully side by side, making the all-pervading suchness even more free, beautiful and ungraspable. All the usual mental classifications and valuations are real only with regard to their bare existence, not with regard to their original conceptual contents. A lie becomes here a celebration of truth, equally as a child's stepping on a frog. This beginning stage may be full of surprising discoveries, but it is already a deep experience bringing radical shifts into the orientation of the mind. In the dual world, the mental values are in the last end largely derived from the fear of pain and the desire for happiness. When the sense of any preference between these two feelings ceases, the whole system of established standards applies no more. The needle of our moral compass starts to turn any direction. The bondage, but also the anchor, has been lifted. The suffering in the life is seen from a new perspective. It is no more the adversary obstructing our well-being. With its impartial look, the non-duality recognizes also its constructive function in the world and in the meditation. In this vision, the suffering is not something to eradicate, but something to grow up from. The non-duality is superior to the duality. It excels the splitted mind in all respects. There is nothing wrong with the world anymore. If one learns its lesson, the world becomes a place of inconceivable richness of possibilities, astonishing beauty and perfection. The world is seen to be deeply sane. By healing oneself, one has healed the whole world. At this time of the practice, I suddenly noticed that my meditation goes different direction than the original Buddha's teaching. And I stopped this kind of development because I certainly did not want to realize that the conditioned and the unconditioned is the same, that the nirvana is the samsara. Certainly this was not understanding of the original Buddha's path, and I stopped artificially this type of meditation. But on the other side, I would say that I am grateful for that experience, and looking back, actually I am quite grateful for that, to have it, so that I can somehow relate and understand what the practice of non-duality can mean, this kind of a crazy wisdom. But on the other side also, to be clear that this is not what Buddha was teaching. So I would say the non-duality in Mahayana does not lead to leaving the samsara, but rather to master the samsara and stay in it endlessly. The serious practitioners of Mahayana actually are making a vow to stay in samsara basically endlessly. And if you look into the Mahayana teachings, which are quite dealing deeply with non-duality, with this non-preference, if you take the great sutra, the Podest Sutra, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. Make the smallest distinction, however, and the heaven and earth will be set infinitely apart. That's the beginning of this majestic sutra, Sinsinming. So that was clearly that I don't want to go that direction. From my perspective, this non-duality can be used certainly along the original teaching of Buddha as an amplifying factor, as something complementary, similarly like the deep stages of concentration. So also some stages of the non-duality can very much serve the purpose of insight along the original Buddha's teaching. But equally, as when the samatha, when the concentration practices are becoming self-sustaining, and they may represent the kind of allurement by this shiny inner self-discovery, so equally this kind of non-duality may go astray into this area of sameness of nirvana and samsara, and eradicating the original direction of the development. So when it is used in a meaningful way, so the non-duality can certainly strengthen the experience of discovery how the things really are, to see more clearly their arising and passing away, to see their impermanence, to see their unsatisfactoriness, in the instability, in the liability to change any time, to fall, break down any time, and even to see their hollowness. These are the three most important qualities to discover, which can trigger and catapult the meditator into the experience of Nibbana. This is the original task of the Buddha's teaching. But also having quite some understanding for those who are following these directions fully as their way for salvation or the way for liberation. Definitely all these three directions are resulting in enormous, undreamed of areas of liberation, true liberation. I don't consider it to be the same kind of liberation. But all these three will certainly feel like the heavy great burden has been put down. On the other side, I was always aware also that there are some teachings actually being somewhere in between the one and the zero. And for example, taking Advaita, certainly if it is presented as the unification or oneness of Atman with Brahman. So that sounds like belonging to the Great One, going for the unity, ending in the area of oneness. But then I was going to Wikipedia, that's my source of information. Sometimes really there is a good information there. I was searching about the definition of Brahman, not to be mixed with Brahma, which is the god, the Hindu god, Brahman. Sometimes in some Hindu schools understood as personal, in some of the schools understood as impersonal. But usually the characteristics, it gets eternal, unchanging, infinite, immanent, transcendent reality. And in this description, it has some similarity with Nibbana. Nibbana is always presented as unconditioned. There is no anything about unconditioned, but unchanging, infinite, immanent, transcendent reality. Nibbana is also understood as the last reality, the real reality. Everything else is kind of empty foam. But the Brahman is always understood as a divine ground of all matter, energy, time, space, being, and everything's beyond. And this is different from Nibbana. You know, just mentioning that especially the modern representation of Advaita, I think it would be not quite correct to qualify them as under the big one. It's somewhere between the 1 and 0, I would say, I would feel, I would get the impression. Similarly, some of the writings of the mystics, I read so few books, so I don't have a direct knowledge about it, but many people told me that Meister Eckhart, that his presentation of this Unio Mystica has lots of qualities of this emptiness. So, you know, there may be some realizations which may be somewhere in between. Finally, even in the Theravada there are two types of liberation, of deliverance, Chetovimutti and Panyavimutti. Chetovimutti means liberated by the purity of mind, by the deep absorptions. Panyavimutti means liberated by insight, by wisdom. And actually what is the most recognized and evaluated is the Ubatobhaga Vimutta, which means liberated from both sides. So quite logically I was thinking about the liberation from all three sides, by oneness, by insight and by non-duality, being the best. And indeed, I remember in this time when I wrote this 3 summits on the Mount Analogue, I was dreaming about this kind of an absolute spirituality, when all these 3, the oneness, the insight and non-duality, are developed into the maximum intensity. I was comparing it to the 3 primary colors, like on the television set. If you take a magnifying glass and look at the television screen, it has just a red, green and blue dots. And when all these 3 colors are in the full intensity and you are a little bit on a distance from the screen appears to be completely white. You know, so that was my understanding 20 years ago. What would be the real liberation I would like to arrive at? Yes. Time to end up this long talking. And I will end it. Sometimes people ask about the meaning of all these spiritual developments. And when I want to tease the people a little bit, so I will say, you know, the highest aim of all these spiritual direction is to become normal. First, wanting to set aside the unhealthy superficial snobbic interest for the spirituality. So the snobs are just turned off. Also revealing another truth about the realizations, especially in the symbolic of the enormous spiritual mountain, that at the moment of realization the whole mountain suddenly becomes completely flat, and you are exactly there where you were when you started. The only things which change, that the burden has been laid down, there is a freedom around everything, and everything in the life of a fully realized people is free will. Do you want to engage or not? Everything is free, nothing compulsory. Ready to live the life anytime. So I hope that with this talk I have inspired you for a serious and systematic spiritual path which will bring accordingly the fruit soon or later.